So in this video we'll talk about the do while loop. Now I have the project back here, so int I is equal to 5 and then while I is greater than 0 we repeat this loop. Okay, so this works. Control F5 to run this and you'll see this is what we get. The game starts in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 play. I'll just create some space here and I'll type out a do while loop. Okay, so this is what the do while loop looks like. You have do, then it starts with an opening curly bracket and it closes down here with the closing curly bracket. Okay, and then you have while and then the parentheses and then that semicolon. So it's important to note that the do while loop ends here with a semicolon. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just go and copy and paste that condition. So it's the same condition, okay, that we had in the while loop, and I'll do the same thing here. So in the body of that do while loop. Now what's the main difference? Well, the main difference is, let's say I make int I equal to -5. This while loop will not execute, but the do while loop will execute. So the while loop is a pre-test loop and the do while loop is a post-test loop. So in other words, with the while loop, it tests this condition, and if it's true, then the loop will repeat, will execute, it tests it again, and so on and so on. It repeats until this is false. Now with the do while loop, it's going to execute like the contents or the body of the do while loop before it does that test. If that test is true, then it's going to repeat that body and test again. So that is why it is a post-test loop. Alright, I'll just run this and you can see what happens. The game starts in -5 now, and the reason why this happens is int I is -5 and this line will print that integer. Okay, so it's going to print -5, then it's going to test it, and then it's going to see this is false. So I is not greater than 0 because it's -5. And so this will fail and the loop will exit, and then it is going to go to the next statement, which is this. Okay, it's going to print that out and so on. So that's the main difference. Of course, if I set this to 5 now, you might expect both of these to run. And actually, if I build and run this, you can see we get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and then 0. Because this loop up here will set that eventually to 0. Okay, int I is up here. It's kind of global to this. So when it reaches this loop here, it is going to have whatever we set it or changed it to in this top while loop, and this will eventually set this actually to 0. It will print out 0 right here. This will fail and it will exit. So I'll go and remove that while loop, Control and F5, and now we will get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 play. In some cases it's useful to initialize your variables in the do while loop instead of right at the top. For the most part, I recommend that you initialize it as soon as you declare your variables, because again, otherwise it can contain garbage. Now, in some cases, so you declare your variable right at the top, and then you can initialize it in the do while loop via, for example, user input. Let's say if your variable is equal to 0, your control variable, then that will exit out of the loop. Okay, so then the user can keep entering values from the keyboard to be saved in that variable, and then you can add those values up and store that maybe in another variable, or you can keep printing those out or whatever the case might be, and then as soon as the user enters 0, okay, if that control variable is the same as 0, then that will then exit that loop. Now we will look at input validation and various other things in upcoming videos. So I just wanted to mention that here quickly, because I'm not, going into much detail here on why that is useful. I just wanted to briefly introduce the while loop. I want to try and separate these things out a bit. So in the upcoming video, I'm going to explore a few input validation things, comparing the while loop and the do while loop. So just as a recap, the while loop is a pre-test loop, and the do while loop is a post-test loop.